In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers. It's me again, Douglas Lane, author of Bash Bash Revolution and big boss here at Sublation Media.
And I'm Ashley Frawley. I'm a sociologist at the University of Kent. I should say I'm Dr. Ashley Frawley. I demand deference. No, I'm kidding. And it's so good to see everybody in the actually I don't see anybody commenting in the chat. Usually we have a couple of people commenting before we get started, but I guess the question today is, what do? We're just gonna have a kind of politics that follows the vibe. Is it all about, chasing whatever stories are, in the news and trying to give a hot take, or are we aiming to do something bigger? Interestingly, if you go back to Lenin also said to chase stars and give a hot take. Not really, but to pick out issues that matter to people. So maybe there's a place for the hot take after all. But anyways, we have some big announcements to make as well. So welcome everyone.
I'm going to just start with the big announcement, which is that in the coming months, I'm not exactly sure what the launch date will be precisely, but it is in the works. We are going to be launching an app, but the app is not designed simply to be an app, but it will be aimed at helping people meet up in person and then have a way to discuss what's been going on politically and some of the topics that will be that we'll choose together to tackle as we attempt. And this is the app is just a technology we're going to be trying to use to create what I'm thinking of as a proto-party. We want to start to discuss amongst ourselves, at least, the potential for and the necessity of some sort of socialist party in the United States and internationally. And so while Sublation Media will never be that party, we're hoping to spark the beginning of a conversation in order to create that party. And not in 100 years, but within the next election cycle, within the next 4 years. Like by the time 2028 comes along, the aim should be to have at the very least a proto-party created, a socialist party that isn't maybe putting up candidates, but that will be organizing the working class internationally. And this is picking up on an attempt that Chris Cutrone made back in 2016 when he launched a campaign for a socialist party. And I want to read that statement from him from back in 2016. We're going to release our own, some new official statement, but this is sort of a quiet, launch. What is it called? When you do a soft launch. This is a soft launch of the new socialist party that will eventually take over the world and, create a globalist state. No, here we go. So, campaign for a socialist party in the U.S. It's what it says at the top. When we're exploring interest in starting a mass socialist political party in the U.S., a mass is more than a sect. Socialist is more than merely democratic or liberal. Political means going beyond social and economic actions, including but not primarily or limited to holding political office. A party is more than a movement or an organization. This will be an unprecedented undertaking, and in many respects, the first real political party in the U.S. The only precedents are the old pre-World War I Socialist Party of America, and before that, the Republican Party of the mid-19th century. He says, we want to include as much of the present avowed left as possible, from liberals to anarchists. We find the existing left to consist of talented organizers and thinkers, but they need a new and different context to be effective. Now they're condemned to ineffectiveness or to more or less to support the Democrats. We're looking ahead to a decade-long, painstaking and patient but deliberate and serious process. The building of a mass socialist political party will fundamentally alter the political, but also the social landscape in the U.S. and internationally and globally. The aim is to take governing power in the U.S. This does not preclude and indeed aims at doing so in direct political cooperation with similar parties taking power in other countries. And then he says, now in 2016 is a good time to begin this project because of the disarray of the existing parties as well as society. This is a window of opportunity with a new generation to embark on a political task and possibility that has been avoided since the 1960s New Left and also avoided since the 1930s Old Left, both of which were conditioned and distorted by the gravitational attraction of the Democratic Party, as well as the dynamics of anti-communism and the Cold War. We're past this now and so can proceed to build socialist politics free of such pressures. He says, the Sanders campaign is a distraction from this task because it is a desperate attempt to reform the Democrats, which will not happen, and even if it did, would not lead to socialism in any way. All existing left social, economic, civic, legal, and political activism of all kinds should be conducted under the political banner of the struggle for socialism. We need to make all these disparate struggles coherent for any of them to be effective. Such struggles should take place in and through a socialist party. And then he says, in the immediate future, the goal is to reconfigure U.S. politics in terms amenable to a socialist left. The Republicans should be the capitalist party. The Democrats should be the party of the middle class democracy. A socialist party should be for the working class in its struggle for socialism. Socialism will be the realization of the social potential made possible, but held back by capitalism. We need a party to pursue the politics of this task. Join us. And then there's an email, which is no longer, I'm sure, functional. But yeah, that's the statement from Chris Cutrone back in 2016, and it's trying to pick up on that attempt that he made then, and try to realize it now more fully. That inspires me to take this step and say we're going to create, I don't know, like a planning meeting for the proto-party, but going to launch an attempt to organize people who are interested in really being independent from the Democrats and the Republicans and creating a socialist party for working class people to discuss the politics of such an effort. So that's what Ashley and I are going to discuss a bit today. To be honest, I've come at politics, I realize now, from the perspective of a artist philosopher and not from the perspective of a political scientist or of a politician. So there are key concepts which I need to be educated on. And one of them, I think, that I was reading about this morning is just the concept of kind of bourgeois politics, what it was meant to be to begin with. I was reading Benjamin Constant this morning, and let's see, I was going to read some of that aloud, but I'll just say that the way to think about bourgeois politics might be to consider Trump's recent controversial statement about voting. He was speaking to a group of Christians, and he was telling them, "Listen, you really need to get out and vote this one time, because this election matters. I know you guys don't normally vote much, but listen, I'm going to come in. I'm going to fix it all. Just vote for me. I'll fix it, and then you won't even have to vote again. You can go back to not voting." And the Democrats responded to this as if he was saying, "I'm going to take charge of everything. There won't be any more, and politics will end with me." But in reality, bourgeois politics are not meant to dominate all of your life. It's about individual representation, and while I'm sure that not voting would probably be to abdicate on your civic responsibility even in the 19th century, the imperative to vote and the imperative to participate in politics is something that under bourgeois liberty, in bourgeois forms of liberty, just doesn't have the same imperative force behind it. That doesn't being compelled to participate in politics as a form of life is what we're supposed to be breaking free from in a bourgeois society. So the question is then, like, why, that Marx develops and socialists of all types wrote about was, why hasn't this been achieved? Why can't we have individual independence from the state? But that's the starting point, I think, for understanding what socialist politics might be like. Not that it would not be a matter of contesting political power in order to maintain political power, but rather contesting political power in order to try to achieve something like what Benjamin Constant said, or what Donald Trump said, which is, you don't even have to vote. So I'll start there. What do you think?
Okay. So it made me laugh a little bit when you said, coming from a particular background and not from the background of a politician. Is that what you said? A politician?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That would be the last background you'd ever want to come from.
I don't know. I think politicians know politics. I think they understand politics much better than most people do. They understand how government works. Go ahead.
Right. Okay. Yeah. They might be experts in the existing, state machinery or whatever, but they're experts in a particular kind of politics that's prevailed during the end of history, which is just to like out PR your opponents. That's like sort of the last thing that you'd want. So it's actually quite good to be alienated a little bit from that. Coming from a philosophical background, perhaps less so. But the question is, practice is empirical, right? So you have to have your understanding of what to do arises from your engagement with the world, and thought is in the world. It is part of the world, and we're not existing this perpetual kind of separation where we can never sort of access reality. We are in reality. That is the thing that is so defining of what it means to be a human, is that we act on the world consciously, and in so doing, we obviously change the world and we change ourselves. It's very famous. So we have to kind of understand, ideally any kind of party is the consciousness of an existing movement. It's a self-consciousness of a movement that is already kind of growing up and coming to understand itself. And it's to make conscious the task before it. And it can't be something that's imposed from above, which is why, our political class is increasingly alienated from the everyday kinds of issues experienced by people. Even this sort of, I say this as someone who uses social constructionism in my own work, but this idea of I like to think of it as a kind of dialectical understanding, but the kind of triumph of postmodernism in the academy, for instance, is such a good example of how, you become so alienated from the world in which things seem real, in which there's an action and a consequence, where you are trapped by a lack of choices, or in which you're acting on the world and the world gives you immediate kind of feedback. If you're in the academy and you're sort of floating around, it's quite easy to imagine that everything is fluid and everything is a social construction. Reality itself is a social construction, this sort of thing. And it's easy to kind of, engage in a kind of strict constructionism that's absolutely mad, because you're so alienated. And in a way, our politics has really latched onto a lot of that politics that hasn't got it, or these kinds of questions about, gender fluidity and that sort of thing, because our politics has also become so alienated. And so the issues that affect people don't seem to make their way onto the political agenda in the same way that a kind of elite preoccupation might make its way onto a political agenda. So that's the first thing, that you want something to kind of arise out of an actual kind of ongoing struggle, which is why, like, the MAGA communists were right to kind of try to formulate around a struggle that was kind of opening up and that had opened up into a political void. And then Trump came along and kind of stamped it with his name, which is the kind of thing that he does, is just brand things. And he sees that there's, a market, an open market. And he says, oh, I will stamp your grievances with my name. And that's kind of the extent of it. But what they recognized was that there was something powerful about that MAGA kind of thing, that there was something powerful about a desire for kind of, I don't know, greatness, as opposed, and I don't know, even I don't know if it's too far to say an aspiration for universality, because obviously people will say, well, it's, isn't it characterized by racism and so on? But there's this kind of like spark of a desire to not be, have our differences be the be all and the end all, have grievance politics be the be all and the end all of politics. I don't know. I know people will say that it is its own kind of identity politics and is its own kind of grievance politics. But nonetheless, they recognize that there was kind of a spark there. And the fact that scared people, and Brexit was the same sort of thing, that really scared the elites, where they wanted to kind of domesticate politics. They wanted, to have the adults in the room, and they do the political organizing, and they, administer to the problems of the underclass. And that's just the way that things should be. You kind of have a charitable outlook on those underneath you, and they should know their place, and you should know your place and be a good king and all these sorts of things. And that was that consensus of the end of history was massively disrupted. And I think that that's a really powerful thing, and they're right to recognize, to kind of latch on to that, and to recognize that any kind of movement has to be a kind of organic movement from below. It can't be imposed from above. And so what form does that take? And the trouble is that those who probably want to join a socialist party probably have a kind of share that horror as the, our governing class of Brexit, of MAGA, supporters, whatever, Trump supporters, that sort of thing. And there's a sense that needs to be broken through, and I don't know how, of a powerful division between the people who feel that they don't have a political voice, who are, the working class or whatever, the working class, who feels that it doesn't have a political voice, and those who kind of have a charitable outlook on politics and want to have a kind of paternalistic, or would feel more comfortable in a paternalistic relationship to those in the working class, or to people who are not sort of educated like them. I don't know if that made any sense, but I think this is a kind of a problem that we have at the moment. I don't know how it's possible to broach something like that, but I do see, if you go on my Patreon, I do apologize that my podcasts now are, one, just me talking and analyzing things, and two, just on Patreon, but like YouTube is taking over my life and is taking up all my time, and it's just too much. So anyways, if you go on my Patreon, you'll see that I've got like a 35-40 minute analysis of MAGA communism, and I do have a lot of critique there, but I do think that that's one of the more powerful things. And then of course they have kind of put all of their force behind also attempting to found a kind of communist party as well. So I don't know if it's a kind of a way, a sense that, oh, we have to go back to party politics, or I don't know, we're just like beating a dead horse. I'm not sure, but I do think that they're kind of right in that impulse.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I think that we're going to be trying to understand as we launch an effort to form a proto-party. So, I mean, to be clear, we're not thinking that we can just snap our fingers, create a logo, and create an American Socialist Party overnight just by calling for it, right? But there is a role for theory in this and understanding. And if we can get a lot of people who are interested in that to be involved in thinking through what the challenges are, perhaps we can begin an effort to create a socialist party. So one of them that, again, Cutron sent me this, was coming from the ideas of the Frankfurt School. Sigmund Neumann wrote an essay called The Party of Democratic Integration. And I've read it, and I'm going to read it again to make sure that I fully understand it. But he writes that that he's writing this in around 1956 or so. So during the period of time where the Frankfurt School is critiquing the administrative state and is concerned about a form of capitalism where the contradictions that are inherent to capitalist political economy has been overcome by the state. But he writes about the way the party of democratic integration has replaced the kind of politics of representation. So the politics of representation would be the politics which don't require people to be so fully engaged with politics. The politics of bourgeois democracies, where civil society is mostly operating independently through commerce, and freedom has been achieved. People thought, and the need for politics was minimal. So you have the politics of representation in a constrained state. So now we've, as capitalism has risen up, we have something called the Party of Democratic Integration. And this fact makes it more imperative to recognize, I'm reading now, the fact of the Party of Democratic Integration makes it more imperative to recognize its basic variance from the Party of Total Integration. So democratic integration as opposed to total integration, which has found its prototype in Bolshevism, fascism, and National Socialism. This all-inclusive party demands the citizens' unconditional surrender, denies not only the relative freedom of choice among the voters and followers, but also any possibility of coalition and compromise among parties. It can perceive nothing but total seizure and the exercise of power, undisputed acceptance of the party line, and monolithic rule. The rise of this absolutist police state decrees the end of democracy, of constitutionalism, of communal self-government, of Western man, and his inalienable rights of political parties. So I bring this up because we aren't quite in a moment where we have parties of total integration, although I think I always suspect that the Democrats are looking to become a party of total integration. I'm not sure if they'd be Bolsheviks, fascists, or National Socialists, but something else probably altogether. But I don't think they've achieved that in reality. And you can see that in the way that they've been running their campaign based on vibes and accusations of their opponents being weird and kind of desperate backroom machinations, and a real concern about persuading the voting public to come out for them on whatever basis they can. So what I think we have right now is a capitalist society dominated by catch-all politics, big tent parties, non-ideological as much as possible. But there's, so the competing to have the biggest tent, but also I think not have to answer to particular voting blocks at the same time. So you keep the tent, make it as big as you can within a realm of voters, which is kept relatively small. But I think that as we think about creating a socialist party, it would be a party of integration, but it would be a party of democratic integration, not total, and it would be struggling against, I think, these parties of these catch-all capitalist parties. And so there are some difficulties that arise from that. The difficulties arise in terms of dealing with the population, which is already stratified and fragmented against itself, and having to operate politically in that domain, in a domain where the reality is capitalism has set aspects of society against themselves, even within the working class, possibly. So, but
Okay, so I've. Oh, sorry, you were going to say.
Go ahead. That's it. And that's all. I mean, but I guess I'm answering your suggestion that political class wants to keep us from realizing our own subjectivity and power. And what
I'm
I
not
would
sure that they
say,
want to keep us from doing that. It's that when we do that, they're shocked because they thought that that had gone.
right. What I would just say is that's maybe overstating the case for us, because I think, at least by looking in American politics right now, what's been shocking to them is changes within their own system of catch-all political parties and capitalist strategies. So, like, the fact that someone like Donald Trump could rise up and bring in voters that didn't used to vote and change the character of one of the parties is shocking to them. But it's not a matter of being shocked by some independent civil society
No, of course.
populist movement.
No, it's just a questioning of what they had thought politics had become. They at that, you had this, ever since the fall of the Berlin Wall, it was like, well, yes, politics will be boring. You have Fukuyama, like the end of politics will be, or the end of history will be a very sad time, right? But it's just a shame, that's just the way it's gonna be. And Karl Popper, this like piecemeal democratic change. That's all that there was ever gonna be. It didn't light a fire under anybody, but that was the best situation. All that craziness from the 20th century, that's all gone. We'd figured it out. You've got your liberal kind of democratic capitalism, where what is democratic is confined to a very small array of policies. That's where, all this other stuff that goes to the experts, and the sphere that is actually contestable democratically gets smaller and smaller. And then and they liked it that way. And in fact, ideally, that democratic sphere should shrink ever more, because really, what do everyday people know anyway? Like, do they even have the ability to have a say in politics? Like, I remember after, the Trump election, everybody's on Facebook, analyzing what happened. And the most common kind of thing you saw was people saying, oh, everybody's a poli-sci major now. Everybody's got a degree in political science. And I was like, no, you don't have to have a degree in political science. But that was kind of the idea, that as you had this, specialization of more and more of everyday life, that all of that more and more of everyday life would be sent up to the kind of technocrats, and what we could actually debate about and what was actually open democratically would get smaller and smaller. And that's just what they thought was going to happen. And then you had this kind of growing discontent bubbling under the surface of this, what appeared to be a quite slick politics of boring, exchanges about tinkering with this or that, or moving things from one place to another. I remember being on, like, I don't remember what it was, Times Radio, GB News or something like that. And they were like, but this is quite a big thing, isn't it? Like a 2p reduction in the blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh my, wow, like everybody's on fire. Big deal. They moved a little bit of money in the tax system. Oh, excuse me. And we're not out in the street dancing. But that's all that it had become. And I think what people failed to realize, it wasn't necessarily that Trump was something that, for a lot of people, obviously he was like this figurehead or whatever. He was quite an important figure that they believed in, like a messiah-like figure. But I think for a lot of people, it was more a vote against the status quo than a vote for somebody. I could be wrong about that, but that's kind of the feeling that I get. And it was against that kind of smug looking down on you, fixing your problems. If only you would, but you got to work with me here. You got to behave properly, right? And this like rise of behavior management, medicalization of everyday life that treats people like perpetual patients and is just so belittling. And the kind of slimming down of the democratic domain in favor of these technocrats who seem to know more about you than you knew about yourself. So I think that's kind of what happened there. It's not that there was like this awakening of civil society or whatever, but there was a kind of reaction against what had become the status quo and this sort of like technocratic management of more and more of society and the shrinking of the democratic domain. And it was just like giving people a punch in the face, essentially, when they had the opportunity.
Yeah. I think that the one way to think about that is that there's a rising dissatisfaction politically within the population, and the way that usually gets expressed on the right is that people feel as though the managers who are fiddling around with the tax rate and things like that are intervening too much in their lives, and that the technocratic regulators and the technocratic mechanisms of some sort of control are thought to be, and they're called like communist, right? They're called like um, totalitarian. And there's the degree to which, especially when compared to the bourgeois promise of freedom, they are, right? But it is worth noting that, the Democratic Party is not yet, and probably, despite my outrage about the way in which they violated the First Amendment over the last few years, not even aiming to be one of these total parties of integration. They really are catch-all parties, and I think, and if you look at the Republican Party, the same thing is true. Like the Democrats will say, "Oh, these Republicans are fascists. They want to create a totalizing party of control." I want to keep that up.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you
That's
meant like
okay.
by mistake.
No, and that's that. So they're fascists. They're going to create a party of total control, a total social integration, and that's this kind of comment here kind of reflects that sentiment. I think it's cybernetic. Qualinot says, if you look at those who are pushing for abortion bans, book bans, and anti-trans legislation, they are also pushing to make elections less relevant and submit the power of the conservative minority. And I would just say that, in fact, having gone to the Republican convention, the both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party accept that the question of abortion is going to be fought out on the level of state politics rather than federal politics. So there's no plan for an abortion ban nationally, nor is there any plan for protecting abortion rights nationally. And we'll see what else was. Book bans. This is a tricky one again. About it's not just about wanting to get to ban books, but it's usually taking place on the state level, county levels, and it has to do with the power of the schools or the some sort of administrators to determine what's appropriate for education in children as opposed to the parents. So it takes the form of book bans. I, of course, lean on the side of the liberal, progressive librarians against the conservative, Christ-loving parents. But the book bans that have been taking place are not about a federal fascist party of social integration. The United States is all broken up into different communities, and it's really being fought on local levels and state levels. And there could not be a plan that would be legislated into place to create book bans, although there could be federal policies about education and what should be taught, I suppose. Anti-trans legislation. This is a political project that has to do with reflecting real discontent and disagreement within society. Especially if you look to the UK, there's questions about medicine and what's appropriate medicine. So it does not reflect any kind of attempt to target a scapegoat in order to create a fascist, socially integrative party, but rather just reflects the kind of regular discontent and disagreement that arises in society. However you feel about these medical questions, I happen to think that the CAS report should be taken seriously. It does not reflect a fascist takeover any more than the Democrats and their woke agenda represents a communist political project. So I just wanted to say that.
Okay, so that comment that you had up there about, those parties or those people that are, or groups that are supporting these things, they also tend to be anti-democratic. I mean, yeah, because they recognize that as soon as you have a change in party, everything that you gained is in jeopardy. But such is the nature of democracy. And this was kind of the issue as well, that part of the reason why Roe v. Wade was overturned was because people grew complacent. It was never going to hold. Like, more work needed to be done. But it was kind of like, well, it held kind of well enough, and there was an awareness that, if you had, it was possible to overturn that, but, people just got complacent. They started arguing about all sorts of other things. And there wasn't a really robust kind of defense of abortion rights. I mean, obviously people were doing a lot of great work, but that campaign to bring it further never really materialized in a real way. And there are those who argue that actually, like, the squabbling about trans kind of deflected people's attention from that. I don't know. But this was this is an issue across the political spectrum, that people have become estranged from the necessity of continually fighting for something, and therefore they seek instead alternative means to lock in their particular policies, or they attempt to evade that debate in the first place. So this is kind of what happened with the trans issue, that in a lot of countries, how it was institutionalized into policy, how particular gender policies were institutionalized, was by bundling it with gay rights campaigns and campaigns for gay marriage, which were very popular. And so when they were drafting legislation, you had these groups that were tasked with helping with that, and they kind of very slyly put in all of this stuff about gender, which hadn't really been on the public agenda, which is why feminist groups were really caught unaware, and they were like, shit, this has been going on for a while. But by the time they realized what was happening, they were not in a very good position to contest things because they'd already been institutionalized. So this has been happening for a while, where people will seek out extra government institutions, especially they will seek out the EU in an attempt to impose certain policies in a top-down way, and therefore to lock them in. But this backfired spectacularly, because if you don't have a public debate and you don't win people over in public debate, you have there's much more potential for backlash, because people didn't even know, yet the people had no idea what was happening in schools or whatever till their kids were coming home and telling them, oh, mommy, did you know that there's 60 different genders or whatever? And because part of that was because there's this whole thing that went on with sex education in schools, where it's an awkward thing. Teachers don't really want to deal with it. And so institutions were quite open to lobby groups coming in, and they had developed all this curriculum. Hey, we've got this curriculum ready to go. It aligns with this new legislation. Can we come into your schools and teach it? And they're like, yes, please. But none of that had been debated. So when people saw it for the first time, they saw it with their kids, and they were really, really horrified. So this becomes a kind of issue where our belief in democracy and the difficulty of living in a democratic society and winning debates has pushed people to seek out all sorts of extra democratic means to lock in their particular policies. And this is across the political spectrum. And the thing that really concerns me is that people who claim to be standing up for democracy, they often do so only because they've been on the receiving end of some quite anti-democratic forces. And so, I see this on the right. Like, I don't have any problem standing on the same stage or working with people who are quote unquote right wing, because often, scratch below the surface, they're just classical liberals, and they're often the last people who are standing up for democratic principles. However, one thing that I have noticed is that I have seen people start to go on that trajectory where they're actually right wing. They're actually right wing, i.e. anti-democratic, like anti-universalist, that sort of thing, in reaction to being pushed out. And so they just want to kind of give the other side a taste of their own medicine. And what winds up happening is there are very few people left who really believe in democracy and who are really willing to try to win debates and push and bring people over to their side through through like a rational engagement with the issues. You can't have a democracy if you don't believe in the human subject. That is, as someone who is capable of, listening to something, reflecting, and rationally choosing how to act. That's the subject that exists below our democratic ideal and that exercises and enacts democracy. Nobody believes in that anymore across the political spectrum. And it's reflected in these people trying to lock in their policies in all these different ways and evade democracy because they don't really believe in democracy anymore. That's the thing that really, really concerns me. That we can never go anywhere good politically if we don't believe in humanity and if we don't believe in reason. We're going to head down a totalitarian path no matter what.
Reading Constant and Newman, one of the things that it did for me this morning was sort of problematize my understanding of democracy by, like, for instance, raising the difference between ancient and modern forms of liberty comes along with distinguishing between ancient and modern forms of democracy. What is democracy for in Athens as opposed to today? It's worth considering. And again, to go back to Constant, what representative democracy was about was having a say in a state which was not so fully integrated into social life, but where civil society or social life was largely run independently on an economic basis, on the basis of commerce, but amongst mostly like yeoman workers and self-proprietors and things like that. And obviously the form of freedom based on labor time is self-contradictory, I think, necessarily, and then certainly historically went into self-contradiction through the industrial revolution. And so now that form of representative democracy has been pushed aside for other forms of democracy. So we have democracy now of some kind, but what kinds of subjects are required to be participating in it have changed. And we do have to hold on to this idea of the subject of history and democratic subjectivity, the Enlightenment ideals. But we also have to think politically at the same time. That's what I'm hoping we can start to do with this project, is say, okay, when we say democracy, what kind of democracy are we wanting to achieve? And how can we help to achieve the kind of democracy that we're aiming at? What kind of party, what kind of social power and political power and economic power would we need to develop from within civil society in order to achieve that goal? It's worth considering and looking back. Maybe one of the things we should do is look back on the last 15 to 20 years and 15 years certainly, and think through how Bhaskar Sankara and the Social Democrats approached this and what they began with and where they ended up. Certainly one turn that I think we should all try to avoid is this idea that building within civil society is a dead end and that we should instead work within the capitalist state and within the political parties that already exist. I think we should, I from the outset, I want to abandon that approach. But when we think about democracy, I think we should, that is actually should be a topic for debate and discussion and exploration, because it's sort of been flattened out. Certainly in this campaign, up until when Kamala Harris took over, democracy is no longer the central issue, but rather weirdness is now what we're going to be voting on in November. But certainly in the this campaign up until now, the idea of democracy had been flattened out to being almost completely meaningless, and had been all it was basically each side calling the other one totalitarian, authoritarian, communist, fascist, anti-democratic.
Mm.
And I happen to think that they are, to a degree, both. But I also think that the fear of that is a political tool that they both, the fear of totalitarianism is a political tool both parties use.
Right. So, I got 2 points that I want to make, and I'm trying to think of how to segue from one to the other. But,
Chris Cutron has something
so-
here I want to read. He says we
Okay,
should vote
sure, yeah.
for but not promote capitalist parties, but only vote tactically and not religiously. The point is that a socialist party would not be immediately electoral. Right. That, sure. I think that's probably right.
Okay. Socialist Party would not
Obviously.
be immediately nor perhaps ever electoral. This is the other problem that we have. First of all, like, as I said before, that like, one, movements have to be organic and they can't be imposed top down. And two, we have to be empirical, that like part of what ostensibly or supposedly made Marxism a science was that you acted in the world, reflected on what happened. And so you had like a failed, Bolshevik, revolution, and then you have a successful one, or and the success comes from recognizing what went wrong and then trying to fix those things in an empirical way by reflecting on your practice and then doing something different. And so in the spirit of that, this word socialism is not a word that people are using on the ground. Some people are, sure. But I think the vast majority of people who are not kind of already in these kinds of circles don't use that word and are actually put off by it. I just always, like, my litmus test is like my brother. And my brother and I actually agree on so much. But because he sees me as like a socialist intellectual, he will never ever come to the realization or allow us to have an agreement. Like, he will not allow us to have an agreement. And the one thing that actually made some progress was just like, he watched some documentaries of the former Soviet Union and how they had gone back. People had gone back and like interviewed after fall of the Berlin Wall and so on. And then 20 years later, recently. And he said, well, just what struck me was not a single person said that things were better now. And it was just this kind of like, I don't know, watching a documentary isn't exactly engagement in the world, but but like this, it had to be like people like him, and he's not using the word socialism. He might gravitate towards something like MAGA, but ultimately, at the end of the day, when we actually speak, we agree on so much. So this is kind of the difficulty, that this word socialist is poisoned. It's poisoned. And I remember years ago, good friend of mine, there are cycles of these talks, what we need is a socialist party, blah, blah, blah. And people at the time said, look, if you really want to have a party that's capable of speaking to the working class, you need to drop this word socialist, because what it does is it attracts what socialism, people who are attached to that word are attached to what socialism has become, which is like a weird movement of social outcasts, of grievances and identities, and not normal people. Not every day, people who take pride.
The weird people, those weird people. It attracts weird people.
Like, there was, I was terrible. There was this meme that was going around that I always think about it. I've never been able to find it again. Of this, like, those poorly drawn people, and it's just, there's a parent with 2 children, and they're like, keeping their children away, like, let's go this way, children, when they see like the leftists like demonstrating and they're like not wearing any pants. And then they're like, I think about that all the time. And it's a caricature, I know, but the word has become kind of tainted, and this is the issue. And I don't know how much of an issue it is. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just like that we have to kind of strip these movements of the identity politics that have taken them over, and to reassert the kind of foundational basis in a working class struggle for a better life, and go from there instead of kind of taking on all this really heavy baggage. But one thing that somebody said in the chat, I think it was someone whose name is AZ, they said the working class is unable to set the agenda without creating some form of hegemony. And that's absolutely right. And this is kind of what has happened. Hold on, I'm just gonna make a note. Frag is something deeper. Okay. The working class is not able to set the agenda because after the sort of end of history, we had this enormous destruction of any kind of unified working class organization. Even the kind of trade union movement started to become more and more institutionalized, more and more entrenched, more less and less militant after certain important defeats, obviously. And so there became no real representation for the working class that was, you know, unified. Instead, you had this like proliferation of single issues. So you're interested in like child poverty, okay, which is the stupidest thing ever, because it's like, what children are just in poverty? Like the parents are out there living it up, but just the
They need
children are in
jobs.
poverty.
Those children need jobs. That's what I think. We can fight
Do you know what I mean? So
child
that's like
poverty.
such a good example of that fragmentation. This actually has real world effects. So now if you like live in really crap accommodation and your landlord is crap and you've got like a mold problem, they'll take the child out of that, right? But not the parent. So they will actually break up that family, right? Because the children have the right not to live in that accommodation, but screw you, you know? So this actually creates all this sort of like fragmentation does create all sorts of problems. And obviously around like, oh God, once you start getting to like gender and race and all these sorts of things, it's just an endless fragmentation that creates these antagonisms between all these different people, which is just great. But what also happens with this division into single issues is that the single issues then come to be owned by NGOs, VCOs, you know, this kind of like social problems class, who literally they go straight from high school to university to be the bearers and the owners of social problems. That their bread and butter is administering to the problems of the lower orders, and this creates a massive divide. And so then you have their interests are not really to kind of ultimately overcome these things, but instead to maintain interest and awareness in the existence of their pet problem, and to have a paternalistic kind of relationship to the people that they administer to, and also to show through various kind of through, you know, having certain cultural capital that they belong in that essentially managerial class, in the sense of like managing the problems of others through, you know, these are my pronouns, these are the linguistic codes that I use. Look, I am a manager, I am not to be managed. Don't throw me down to them, you know. So this creates all these kinds of problems. And so you have to, if you are trying to think about what and what I worry about, this is the note that I'm writing, is that fragmentation may represent something deeper. That there may be certain changes in the organization of society in general that feeds into this fragmentation, and a difficulty with creating a united movement, because we also no longer, or because of changes in how mass society is expressed or exists now. And that's a bit tricky. On the other hand, you have a consolidation at the top of parties, as you said, like a catch-all party, right? It's just like you have an umbrella under which like anything goes, or as long as you kind of maybe use a certain linguistic code or kind of outlook. So that's huge. That's a quite broad umbrella, and that kind of stands in sharp contrast to this proliferation of single issue things and everybody having their own little identity group that gets some funding from the government to lobby the government, you know. I don't know how anything can overcome that. And the other thing is that you have an institutional barrier. Once you have a two-party system, it becomes almost impossible to break through that. So this is the massive kind of wall that exists and has been. This is the politics of the void. This is the void that we've been living with for, 3-4 decades almost, that we have not really been able to overcome. And having this commitment to being empirical means that we can't just be like, hey, let's just do this thing again, but also to ask why this thing didn't work in the past.
I just think that what I'm trying to arrive at, the idea of this project for a proto-party is the conclusion that we'll all start with, and we have to, I guess, work our way to it. And I feel like one of the things I've been doing is working my way towards this conclusion, which is that the fragmentation and atomization and alienation that we're experiencing under capitalism is not merely, it's certainly not a natural problem, like just that's how human nature is, or that's how the world is. It's also not just an economic problem. It's not just a problem that if we could only, I don't want to put us in a catch-22 or bootstrap situation where we have to create a political project under conditions of capitalism that absolutely shut the door to a political project.
No, I didn't mean to say that. I didn't
but
mean
it's
to
not
be like,
just a
this
matter
is
of
why
like,
it won't work.
I know, but I do think that even if you don't mean to say that, if you think in a certain way as I have, and even you do kind of reach that conclusion. It's like, okay, I have to get rid of the commodity form before there can be a political project that will be not alienated, and we can realize our own humanity, right? So it's like, oh, but I can only eliminate the commodity form if I do that second thing, which I can't do until, so it's a catch-22 or a bootstraps problem. But I think we can say now, one of the nice things that are emerging through the crisis in politics, so we can see that the economic is political in the sense that the attempts to manage and run the political order have economic consequences and vice versa, and that changing the political order does make changes on the material basis that does happen. It doesn't. Right now it's sort of happening arbitrarily or in a reactive way because we're leaving it to the opportunistic capitalists. But if we conceive of this as a political problem, then creating a political party might be able to address it. And I want to say something about socialism and reaching the working class. Like, we're not in a position to offer the working class much. So what do we need to reach them for exactly? What we need to do as socialists, intellectuals, is conceive of what we would want to do with a political party. What kind of party might be useful, and along the way develop a culture that might be welcoming to all sorts of people, and maybe not a catch-all, but that would be aligned with the working class. And I think we should start from with the idea that working class people in cities, working class people in rural areas are in different ways ahead of the left. That we need to think about what their priorities are, not because we need to reach them, but because they can teach us about what society is aiming at. So
yeah, but I don't know, I'm just sort of like uncomfortable with this idea of like, maybe I should save this for the Patreon.
No, it's okay. Say it now and then we could go over to the Patreon. But what were you gonna say?
No, I'm uncomfortable with this idea of like this group that forms and like, okay, look, I know that there has to be a solution here, and then just like hunting around for your base. Do you know what I mean? Like, who's my base? Who's my base? Oh, that's terrible. It's like, I see myself as growing out, like the way that I think grows out of a particular struggle that I have had in my life. And that growing out of my family's kinds of struggles, this sort of thing. And my husband's struggles, my father-in-law, and like the village that I live in, and the things that I've been through. That is what brought me to search, to be a seeker. And I see it more of for answers, for understanding, to understand my predicament, to understand how the world is and where it's going. And it gives me a sense of agency as well. And it gave me a sense of agency over these impersonal economic processes that seem to just be throwing me all over the place. And so I see it more as like, if you feel that way too, and you are searching for solutions, and you know that things can be better, you see the better world just beyond the horizon, and you're trying to get to it, then come to us and let's do it together. Let's try to get there together. I don't see it as like seeking out something, but for other people who are also coming to these same conclusions and want to understand and give consciousness to their struggle, that's what I see us trying to do, because it's what I have tried to do in my own life. Is to, understand, to change it. You know, you don't want to be a philosopher. You want to change the world.
Okay. Well, let's pick that up again in the parrot room. I'm gonna create a link to it and put it in the comments in the show notes, or the description on YouTube for this stream. I think it went well. It's just the beginning here. We're just the soft launch of the proto-party and the app. There are other things that are going to be included in the app, but really the what we're hoping is that communicating with us and with each other, and meeting in real life, those things will be the foundation of what Sublation is doing, as we get into whatever is happening next after this election. So
yeah, and I'll answer the questions. Will we party? Will it be Sublation singles? I know that's what you really want to know. That's the questions that came up in the chat.
So someone asked here, the proto-party app. I'll just say what I said at the beginning. We are going to be launching an app which will be used to have discussions with people who are following Sublation Media, reading the books. But more importantly, we want to schedule meetups, and with the aim of creating a proto-socialist party that we want to have this form of communication have a political purpose, and that will be coming in by the end of the summer. Join us in the parrot room
and tell us what you want to see from a movement in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Let me where's the button? Here's the button.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as